Hey again, and welcome to our Integrating Quotes and APA lecture. So let's get started. The goal of today's lecture is to talk a little bit about the process of integrating a quote into our own writing, something I hope you'll find useful as you continue to work on your autoethnography and think about ways you're going to integrate outside resources into your project. So what am I trying to do? Full screen. Let's start. So I wanted to take a look at this um, sample excerpt from an article. We haven't read this article, but I just think that the way that these quotes are integrated, or this quote is integrated, is especially useful. So the paragraph starts, "But according to the professor, this is not enough. People also suffer when they receive health services, social services, education, and public information in a language they do not understand," he said. To back up his argument, he cited the case of a researcher who was treated politely by four banks in central Kingston when he spoke standard English, but rudely when he spoke Jamaican patois. He also referred to tests of oral comprehension of English in news broadcasts among Jamaicans that showed up to 40% did not understand them clearly. So the outside quote here is this "people also suffer" quote. I want you to just take a couple of minutes and look through this paragraph and notice the way in which the writer integrates this quote into his own writing. Um, Take notice of phrases that might be used. Take note of how the author sort of cites the quote even after the quote has been put there in direct quotations. In other words, even though the author has given the direct quotes, the quote is still a part of the entire paragraph. And so thinking about how that's done. All right, so hopefully that wasn't a minute, but you took some time to think about that, and now I just want to go through it. Um, so this, "but according to the professor, this is not enough." What the writer is doing here is sort of giving some context. So context is where you give the reader information, usually about the stuff that came before the quote that the reader is not familiar with, the stuff that was going on when the quote was written, that the reader is not aware of, stuff that the reader is not aware of that you want to make them aware of because it adds to the meaning of the quote. So here, this "but according to" sentence is giving readers the context of the quote that's about to follow is, one, from a professor, and two, is going to talk about how something is not enough. Why give context? Well, so that your reader can immediately jump into this quote and have some understanding of what's going on. The next thing I wanted you to see is the "he said." That's something called a signal phrase. And a signal phrase is basically where you have a subject and a verb. The subject being the person that said the quote, and the verb being how the subject is saying the quote. So is he arguing this? Is he saying this? Is he exclaiming this? That's something you might think of, and notice how it's attached directly to the quote because the writer wants you to know that it's this person who said it. Then I wanted you to see to back up his argument. This is an interesting technique used when integrating quotes where the writer is explaining the kind of writing that he's quoting. Or is offering the kind of writing that this source that he quoted from uses. Then you have the "he cited" sentence, and what's interesting about this is it's not a quote, it's a paraphrase, right? So he goes from quoting what this professor says to then saying, and the professor goes on to argue, the professor supports this argument by doing this, by doing this, by doing this. So not giving the word for word quote where he's giving the testimony of this researcher, but instead this writer is just paraphrasing it. And so those are some of the things that you can do when you're putting quotes into your paper, but these are also the kinds of decisions you have to make when you're integrating a quote into your own paper, right? So you need to figure out, what kind of context do I want to give? How do I want to attach a signal phrase? What kind of writing does this source use? Do I want to mention the kind of writing that this source is using? What do I want to paraphrase versus what I want to directly quote? So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the kinds of decisions that we make when we're integrating quotes, by offering you some suggestions. And I put here rules, but I want you to look at it as suggestions. So the first thing that we need to understand is, why do we use quotes in our writing? Why do we paraphrase? And what is the difference between using quotes and using paraphrase? So quotes are when you're taking word for word something from another source and inserting it into your own writing. We tend to use direct quotes when we feel like there's no other way to say it other than the way that it's presented in the source. And when we bring in a quote word for word from another source, we have to make sure that we cite correctly, so we're not plagiarizing, which is something that's mentioned on our syllabus when you take someone else's words and sort of put forth that it's your own when it's not. We paraphrase when we really like an idea or a sentence that another source is sharing, and we want to bring it into our own paper, but we want to put it in our own words. We tend to paraphrase, I want to say, throughout our projects, because so much of our writing is influenced by stuff that we've read or we've seen. So I would say that there's a sense of importance in giving and bringing in a direct quote that is not necessarily present in a sense when you're paraphrasing. And when I say a sense of importance, I mean you're drawing attention to the source, because you're saying this source could not be said any other way than presented here. At least that's my perception of the difference. So here are some reasons we also use quotes. I organize it into 4 categories. To illustrate your own thinking. So you want to bring in a quote because it provides a description that shows exactly what you're trying to say. So for example, if I'm saying The Nun should be a comedy, and I write, during the first 20 minutes of the film, the main character screams X, Y, and Z. This is me using a quote to illustrate my thinking. In order to show you that this film is a comedy, I'm bringing in what the character says because it shows what I mean when I say comedy. You also bring in quotes to back up your own thinking. So you'll bring in a quote because it has evidence that confirms a point of view that you are trying to make. So for example, often politicians say one thing but do another. For example, de Blasio argued for racial equality in schools. However, he has cut 65% of city funding for public schools. So I, again, am saying what I believe and supporting what I believe by using outside quotes. And if you remember what I said about when you bring in a quote, it shows that it's especially important. It can also show that what you're saying is especially credible, because this outside source is supporting what you're saying. Another reason why you would bring in quotes is to prove that you are correct, similar to backing up your own thinking. So for example, gentrification is actually increasing our literacy rates in the Bronx. In 2008, before gentrification, literacy rates were at a low of 10%. Now they're at 17%. So again, I bring in a quote that just confirms what I said in the sentence before. Another reason is to cite your opposition's point of view. Opponents like X believe gentrification is worse than the plague. However, gentrification has many positive benefits to our community. So sometimes if you feel like your opposition's point of view is really icky, or you just feel like you want to make the reader understand that it's not your own understanding or your own point of view, you'll cite them, you'll quote them, so that it's clear that it's an outsider's perspective. And so here are two sentences. Diabetes is caused by obesity. The novel Twilight showcases the dangers of an abusive relationship. So you might think about what kind of quotes you would use to support these two sentences and why. And so I'll share with you. To support that diabetes is caused by obesity, I might quote a stat that says 75% of people with diabetes are also obese. I might illustrate my thinking by quoting a doctor who explains why diabetes is caused by obesity. For the novel Twilight showcases the dangers of an abusive relationship, I might again illustrate my thinking by quoting a passage from the novel that shows abuse. So that's a little bit about why we bring in quotes into our writing. And here is a suggestion for how you can organize or how you can integrate a quote. You can think of it, and apologies again if you have heard this in 111, but I think it's a really important lesson to go over. Well-integrated quote is a lot like a sandwich. So on top, you have a sentence that is giving your own thought, your own summary, maybe setting the context up for the quote that you're going to mention. The meat is the actual quote, usually with some sort of signal phrase or tag. And then after the quote is where you explain the quote's significance or you reflect on the quote's connection to your idea or your overall thesis. And so let's go a little bit deeper into what the first part is. So again, on top, you are setting up the context, right? And I like to think of this sentence as the preparation. Let's prepare you for the quote. And in this sentence, you can do things like give the author's credentials. So the author who has written the quote you're about to bring in, you can tell us a little bit about that author. The professor, Professor so-and-so received a doctorate from Yale. Or Professor so-and-so conducted research in China for 15 years. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is you can explain the overall argument of the article you're about to quote. You can describe the kind of information you need to support your argument, and then the quote sort of comes in to save the day. So for example, to understand the controversy of English in Jamaica, we need to know Jamaica's history. And then you give a quote that, talks about Jamaica's history. You can also, in this preparation sentence, explain how your thinking is a part of a larger conversation. So you can do something like, I'm not the only one who believes this. In fact, and then you bring in your quote. And then the bottom sentence that I was talking about where you reflect on the quote, I think of it as a breakdown quote. And so you can do things like say, in other words, and then rephrase the quote, emphasizing the parts that are important to you. You can do things like the author illustrates and explain what the quote is proving or illustrating. You can do something like, while Y fails to mention X, he does get to the heart of the issue, which is basically where you're talking to the quote and having a conversation with it, and you're showing the reader like, hey, this quote misses this point, but the reason why I'm interested in it is because it really gets at this other point that I'm invested in. Currently, we have seen Y's ideas at work in the election. This is where you're reflecting on the way the quote connects to a specific time period or a specific location or maybe a specific argument. So those are all the ways that you can sort of organize the breakdown part of the integrated quote. And I just wanted to bring this up. A while ago, we talked about the meal strategy, and so you could still use the meal strategy and have integrated quotes. You could just think of the example part as sort of twofold. You have the example lead-in sentence, and then you give the example, and then the analysis of the example. So everything stays the same. It's just that the E sentence becomes split with a context sentence and then an example. And so these are just quickly some rules that I feel as a writer I've discovered that I wanted to share to you. First, I don't recommend ending a paragraph with a quote. I don't recommend starting a paragraph with a quote. I think it's a good idea to keep one or two short quotes in your paragraph, no more, because then it starts to teeter on becoming another person's paper. And I do believe that every quote should be well integrated in the way that I've described in the previous slides. So about that quote, about that rule about quoting sparingly, if you have a quote that you feel like is super long and it's important to bring in, you can do something like break the quote apart. So you give a small part of the quote, and then you can do something like the author wrote, offering justification for his actions, and then another small part of the quote he added, so that at least you're interrupting the quote and giving your narration of what's happening, so that the reader doesn't lose you for too long. And another way to make sure that you're quoting sparingly is to really just quote the good stuff. Things that are memorable, things that are controversial, things that are especially clear or concise. How do you know if something's memorable? If it can't be said any other way, if it is something that you can develop an entire paragraph around. So you feel like you put this quote in your paragraph and then you'll need 5 sentences to explain it. That's usually a good sign. That means that the quote is so dense that it'll give you a lot of stuff to write about. And if it sticks out if you close the book that you were reading and you remember that quote, then that quite literally means it's memorable. Another just thing to remember is when you're bringing in quotes, please make sure your sentence is still grammatically correct. So for example, she states that the flower is lovely, also pretty. Just because we have quotes doesn't mean we don't abide by the laws of grammar, right? So it should say, she states that the flowers are lovely, also they are pretty. So just be mindful of that. And these are just some quoting, I call them illnesses, that you want to be aware of. The salting syndrome, that means if I were to remove the quotes from your paper, nothing would change. If nothing would change, that means that your quotes aren't an important part of your paper, and they're not integrated. The weak wave is where you bring in so many quotes that the quotes actually overtake your paper and the readers become more interested in the people you're quoting and have no idea of what your voice is. You don't want that to happen. The drear McDrear is when you keep saying say, said. People don't just said, right? People can exclaim, people can acknowledge. Try to vary the use of verbs. And here are just some examples of how you can situate a signal phrase. You can say something like, as Jane Doe goes on to explain, Jane Doe believes that, Jane Doe claims that, as one critic points out, according to Jane Doe, in the words of John Doe. So these are some ways that you can create signal phrases. And then these are all of the verbs, or not all of the verbs, some of the verbs you can use instead of said. And I'll just say it, I guess, out loud. Acknowledges, adds, admits, affirms, agrees, argues, asserts, believes, claims, comments, compares, confirms, contends, declares, demonstrates, denies, disputes, emphasizes, endorses, grants, illustrates, implies, insists, notes, observes, points out, reasons, refutes, rejects, reports, responds, states, suggests, thinks, underlines, writes. And here what I have are two examples. The first example is from a student who decided not to use really any of my suggestions, and the second is of a student who did use my suggestion. So let's look at the first. She was waiting for us, her figure defined by the light from the half-open door. Her brother always teased her before he obeyed. Frequently in Araby, Joyce uses light to show change. The narrator's house is described as an uninhabited house of 2 stories, stood at the blind and detached from its neighbors in a square ground. Air musty from having been long enclosed hung in all the rooms, and the waste room behind the kitchen was littered with old useless papers. Joyce shows the narrator's epiphany. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and despair. So the issue that we have here is, though these quotes are powerful, I have no idea of what I'm supposed to take from those quotes. And I also don't get a sense of what the main idea is in this paragraph. And that has everything to do with the fact that this paragraph starts with a quote, ends with a quote, and there really isn't any explanation of what these quotes are supposed to show me. And so let's look at the next example. In Araby, Joyce uses light to illustrate the epiphany of the main character. When the narrator sees Megan's sister for the first time, Joyce writes, "She was waiting for us, her figure defined by the light from the half-open door." This use of light shows contrast with the author's earlier use of description. In the first paragraphs of the story, Joyce uses words such as blind and musty to establish the dreary environment of the narrator. After the narrator sees Megan's sister, she becomes a source of light that prevents him from seeing the darkness of his world. So again, you'll see here that it's changed, right? Now we begin with sort of a context sentence, then we get another context sentence, and then we get the quote. And right after the quote, we're told why the quote is so important. The interest here is with the light. And so I won't read the second paragraph just for the sake of time, but I do think that you should take a look at it because the PowerPoint is attached here, and notice the important impact some of these suggestions that I gave you have to the meaning of the writing. Okay, so now what I want to talk about is APA. APA stands for American Psychological Association. It's a type of citation style traditionally used for folks in the social sciences, like social work, like political science, like computer science even. And so that's the reason why I decided that I wanted to teach it, because though this is a humanities course and MLA is the preferred style for humanities, APA is a more difficult citation style to teach. There are 3 features of APA. There's the format of the actual paper, there's the method in which you cite in the actual paper, and then there's the way that you create a reference page. So I wanted to just briefly explain all 3 of these parts. There's tons of information out there about APA, so I trust that if you're still confused, you'll be able to go and do some research of your own. So in terms of formatting, you need a header that has the title of your paper with the page number. You need your name as the heading, and you want the paper to be double-spaced, Times New Roman, and size 12 font. How does that look? I wanted to show you right here. Nope, that is not what I need. Here you are. So again, you'll see the title is in all caps here, and I double click here to get to the header. The page number is here. You'll see that it should really be your name, my name, is just one line, and then you can center your title again here and then begin your paper. You'll see that this is size 12 font, and this is actually not Times New Roman, but it should be. And that's an APA style paper. Okay. Then we have the in-text citation. Now for the in-text citation, what that means is when you're quoting from an outside source, how do you present where you got that quote from? And what do you have to present about this quote? And so for APA, when you quote from an outside source in the body of your paper, you must present the quote's author, and the only thing I need about the author is the author's last name, the year this publication was published, and the year this piece was published, and the page number from which you found the quote. Now, if there's no author, you just give the title of the work. If there's no date, and I should have really written this, you would put ND. N.D. If there's no page number, then you just don't give a page number. You don't have to write, no page or anything. So there are two ways that you can present all of this information. The first way is giving the quote and then giving all of that textual information in parentheses at the end of the quote. So the alligator swam away. The author's last name is Dundee, comma, 2019 is when it was published, comma, I found it on page 4, close parentheses, and then the period at the end. The other option I have is to mention the author's name in the actual sentence, because remember, some of these signal phrases give the author in the actual sentence. And if I do that, then I would put the year of publication, and this comma should not be there. I don't know why it's there. The year of publication right after I bring up the author, then I give the quote, and then I put the page number after. Because I gave the author's last name and the year, at the end of the quote, all that's left to give is the page number. Some things to notice: the period is always outside of the citation. If you mention the author's last name in the sentence, the year comes right after. And page number is P dot. It's not PG, it's not a big P, it's not PAGE in caps lock, it's just P dot. Okay. And then finally, the reference page. The reference page should have references centered. You need to use something called a hanging indentation, and it should be in alphabetical. All of the sources should be in alphabetical order. And so I just want to show you, what that would look like. So you'll see here references. You'll see here, I did not alphabetize this, but I should have, that it has a hanging indent. You see how this is indented? That's what a hanging indent is. And to get a hanging indent, you highlight your entire paper, you click on Format, Paragraph, you go to Indentation, and you would click on Hanging. And so you need to determine what your sources are, like what kind of sources they are. If it's a book, you need to look up how to format a reference citation for a book. If it's an article, you need to figure out how do you give a reference citation for an article. And you can find all of that information on sites like OWL Purdue. I provide a basic set of information in the handout that's on our Blackboard page. But like I said, there's no reason why you shouldn't quickly be able to go to OWL Purdue or a site similar to OWL Purdue and find that information. And I know there are things called citation generators. I, for the most part, trust these citation generators. So if you feel like you're comfortable with using those, by all means, just make sure you remember citation generators aren't great with the formatting of the actual words. So things like making sure everything is not caps locked, making sure certain things are capitalized, that kind of stuff, a citation generator will not take care of. So that's your responsibility. And that's really it for your comment for this YouTube video. I want you to pick a quote from one of the readings in this module, and I want you to integrate it into a paragraph of your own words. And I want you to use APA in-text citation to when you're quoting from whatever reading you choose. And then at the end of this paragraph, I'd like you to try to provide a reference citation for the source that you use. So if you determine that the source you're quoting from is an article, provide a reference citation as that you do research on and discover is necessary for an article. If you figure out that your source is an excerpt from a book, Google and see how do you give a reference citation for a book. I'm going to trust that you'll be able to manage that kind of research. I think it's also important for you to do that kind of research because it's what you'll have to do when you're doing APA style papers in your future classes. And until then, just so you know, we have one more module left, which is super exciting. If you made it this far, there's absolutely no reason why you won't be able to finish strong. So an early congratulations, and we'll officially celebrate in a couple of weeks.